The Great Gatsby, Chapter 1, Part 1, or read along. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college, I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that. As my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeated, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. At this point, I'm thinking about the father's advice. His fathers told him that whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all of the people in this world haven't had the advantages you've had. And I'm thinking that's very similar to saying the fundamental decencies are parceled out unequally at birth. So, how would you put that advice in your own words? And do you agree with that advice? And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and had a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more righteous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, with heightened sensitivity to the promises of life. And if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away, this responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness, such as I have never found in any other person, which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. At this point, I would make a prediction. He says that Gatsby turned out all right at the end, and he says it's what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest. What do you think happened here? He says that it turned out all right in the end, but something preyed on him, and it closed out his interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. What's he saying here? What do you think happened? My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Caraways are something of a clan, and we have tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, a special reference to the rather hard-boiled paintings that hangs in my father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like a ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everyone I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could take one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, "Why, yes," with a very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. We found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80 a month, but at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out of the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge, and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great burst of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again that summer. There was so much to read for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit, investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shiny secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Mecenas knew. I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, righteous island, which extends itself due east of New York, where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, just out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. So at this point, I'm really trying to imagine this map where he's saying they look, the spaces look like eggs. And he's describing it, the map of this place. So I'm trying to picture that as I read through it. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomena is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this was a most superficial tag to express bizarre, or the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighborhood's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. At this point, he's describing living in a pretty beat up house next to a giant mansion. And I'm wondering if this reminds you of anything, if you've ever seen either in real life or in fiction, two separate places, one very fancy or very rich, and one not that way. So I'm imagining, do you have a connection to this idea of rich and poor living side by side? Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins at the evenings. I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. All right, so we're finally going to meet some characters in this story. It's been going for a while without many characters here. We're moving quickly, but it seems like now we're going to be meeting Tom and Daisy, the cousins. Her husband, among the various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family was enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took my breath away, or took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Here I'm wondering if you know anyone like Tom, or if Tom reminds you of anyone. When they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. Here, I'm really thinking about this idea of polo ponies, and we have to know that Tom plays this sport that looks like this, where people ride around with mallets on horses. It's a very expensive sport to play. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open in the warm, windy afternoons, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. So we're getting closer to a scene in this story, right? We've got Tom on the front porch, and we're going to meet these guys. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. And because this is a word I don't use very often, I looked it up, and it means behaving or looking as though one thinks one is superior. So that's a good word, supercilious. He is behaving as though he thinks he's superior, or he looks as though he thinks he's superior. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing. You could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of a fractiousness he conveyed. He was a touch of paternal contempt in it, or there was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked. And there were men of New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion of these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm strong and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including it in the sweep of sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses and snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. We walked through the high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows either end. So here we're really having to do a lot of visualizing. We're visualizing this really fancy house, and we're going into it now. The windows were ajar and gleaming, white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as the wind does on the sea. So that's really interesting to me that his house is like a wedding cake on the ceiling and the rug is like wine. It's interesting that he's comparing it to food. Kind of fancy food too. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as they had been blown back and after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of the picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear door and caught the wind, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtain and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. So now I'll meet two more people. We're going to meet two women here. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of the eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. At this point, I'm wondering if you've ever been in a situation like that where you feel sorry for disturbing someone even though you're invited there. Have you ever been in that place where you might apologize for even being there, like you don't belong? The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held her hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the bouncing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, or irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. So I'm really picturing Miss Baker, kind of sticking her nose up here, having very good posture, I'd say. Again, a sort of apology arose from my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes and will never be played again. Her voice was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black in mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. Oh, how gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irreverently, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. So here, it seems like these cousins are kind of goofing around, and we found out that they have a baby together that maybe we've never met, or our narrators never met before. And I'm wondering if you have any family members like this, that if you have any cousins or you have people that you go visit sometimes. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's... Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What you doing, Nick? I'm a bondman. With who? I told him. Never heard of him, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. Been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. At this point, I'm realizing that these people have been drinking a lot. Might be, a little inebriated. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted woman with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulders, like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know someone there. You don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby, demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set tightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open towards the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year. She looked at us radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down on the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her finger. Look, she said, or she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black or blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to do it, but you did it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great hulking physical specimen of a... Oh, I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, and with their bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later, the evening too would be over, and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on a second glass of corky, but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be terribly pessimistic about things. Have you ever read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man, Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everyone ought to read it. The idea is that we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proven. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was it that we... All right, at this point, I'm pretty shocked to find out that that Tom is pretty racist, it sounds like. He's reading a book about white supremacy. So that's really shocking to see. And then that Daisy called it a deep book. But it's pretty shocking. Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are in the dominant race, to watch out. And these races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously towards the fervent sun. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. The idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization, science and art, and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic of his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned towards me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. And I'll stop reading here for today. But at this point, I'm wondering if you've ever heard people talk about white supremacy like this, kind of this shocking way, if you've ever heard that in your life. All right, a quick review of what we've seen so far. We have our narrator, Nick. He's from the Midwest, and he fought in World War One. He's moved to near New York to make money on Wall Street in bonds. He said he lives in the not so nice area of town, but he's next door to a mansion, which is the Gatsby's mansion. And in this chapter, he goes to visit his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, and they are very rich. Should also throw in here that he meets Miss Baker, who's going to be a character later in the book. But at this point, we don't know much about her. We know that maybe she knows Gatsby, but that seems to be about it. Looking forward to the second part of chapter 1. I'm wondering what the rest of this dinner is going to go like. I'm wondering if anything's going to come of the white supremacy talk that came up from Tom. And I'm wondering who exactly this Gatsby guy is and if we'll find out more about him.